I was so embarrassed I could barely breathe. At my own sister's wedding, everyone laughed at my dress like I was a joke. But what truly shocked me was how her husband couldn't stop staring at me the entire night. I never thought a simple dress could become the center of a family's cruelty. But that's exactly what happened on the day my sister Claire got married. For months leading up to her wedding, our home had been a swirl of excitement and tension: fittings, flowers, tastings, decorations, endless arguments about color palettes and guest lists. Claire had always been the golden one, the one who got everything she wanted, the one our parents doted on as if the sun rose and set around her smile. I loved her, or at least I tried to, but every interaction felt like a reminder that I was the shadow in her perfect picture. When she got engaged to James, a wealthy architect with a kind smile and an even kinder heart, she didn't stop glowing for weeks. Our parents were ecstatic, gushing about how lucky she was, how proud they were to finally be hosting such a glamorous wedding. And through it all, I clapped and smiled, pretending that my chest didn't tighten each time I was reminded of where I stood in this family, somewhere between invisible and inconvenient. It wasn't that I wanted her spotlight. I just wanted to belong in the same light, even if just for a moment. When the bridesmaid list came out, my name wasn't on it. I thought it was a mistake. I waited for her to call me to tell me it was an oversight. When she didn't, I confronted her gently one evening while she was trying on yet another designer gown. "Claire, did you forget to add me to the bridal party?" I asked, laughing a little to hide my discomfort. She didn't even look up from the mirror. "Oh, Lucy," she said, with that sugar-coated tone she used when she wanted to sound kind but couldn't bother to be. "I just thought it would be less awkward if you came as a guest. You know how I'm going for a particular aesthetic, right?" It's nothing personal. It was personal. Everything with her always was. I nodded, pretending to understand, but her words burned. Apparently, my face, my body, my clothes, my entire existence didn't fit her carefully curated world. That night, I sat on my bed and stared at the only dress that had ever truly meant something to me. My grandmother's gown. It was soft champagne silk, simple but timeless, with delicate embroidery at the neckline that looked like it had been kissed by light. Grandma had worn it to her own wedding decades ago and left it to me when she passed. It wasn't trendy, but it was full of love and memory. And somehow, I decided that would be what I wore to my sister's big day. The morning of the wedding was a blur of forced smiles and fake warmth. I arrived at the venue early, not because I was eager to be there, but because I couldn't bear the thought of walking into a crowd and seeing everyone turn to look at me. The hall was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers, gold-trimmed tablecloths, and flowers everywhere. I felt small the moment I walked in, like I'd stepped into someone else's dream. As the guests started arriving, the air filled with laughter and clinking glasses. I found a seat near the back, hoping to blend into the background. But blending in was never really an option when my sister was around. She made sure of that. When Claire appeared, draped in a designer gown that sparkled like 1,000 stars, everyone gasped. Cameras flashed, and people whispered about how stunning she looked. I joined in the applause, smiling genuinely for a second. She was beautiful, I couldn't deny that. Then she turned and saw me. Her smile faltered, and a sharp glint flickered in her eyes. "Oh my God, Lucy," she said loudly, enough for several people around us to turn. "You actually wore that old thing?" It was like a switch had flipped. A few of her bridesmaids turned their heads, snickering. My mother pressed her lips together to hide a smile. My father cleared his throat and looked away, pretending not to notice. The laughter started as a murmur, then spread like wildfire. "Vintage, huh?" someone said mockingly. "That's brave." I stood there frozen, clutching my clutch bag so tightly that my fingers ached. My cheeks burned and my throat felt tight, but I refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. I wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the air. But then, something unexpected happened. I felt someone's eyes on me, not mocking, not cruel, just steady. I looked up and met James's gaze. The groom, my sister's soon-to-be husband. He wasn't laughing. He didn't even look amused. Instead, There was something else in his expression. Curiosity, sympathy, maybe even admiration. He smiled softly, like he was apologizing on behalf of everyone else in that room. It was the smallest gesture, but it reached deeper than any words could. For the first time that day, I didn't feel completely alone. The ceremony began, but I could barely focus. The pastor's voice was distant, muffled under the noise of my own thoughts. All I could think about was how easily they'd humiliated me, and how normal it was for them to do it. This wasn't new. My family had always found ways to make me feel less than. When I got a scholarship, my mother said, "Well, at least you're good for something." When I got promoted, my father joked that maybe I could finally buy myself some decent clothes. And Claire, she had perfected the art of passive cruelty, the kind that looked like love if you didn't listen too closely. As they exchanged vows, I studied James. There was something different about him, something that didn't belong to this family of glittering facades and hidden rot. When he said "I do," his voice was calm, sincere. But when his eyes brushed mine for the briefest second, I saw hesitation. It was fleeting, gone in an instant, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. After the ceremony, while everyone rushed to take photos, I slipped away to the side garden. The air outside was cool and quiet, the music and laughter fading into the distance. I leaned against a pillar and finally let my mask fall. My hands trembled as I wiped away the single tear that escaped. I hated that they could still hurt me so easily. I hated that I still wanted them to love me. I was deep in my thoughts when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and it was him. James stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, a soft frown on his face. "You shouldn't let them do that to you," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it, like he'd seen it all before. I forced a smile. "It's fine. I'm used to it." He shook his head slowly. "You shouldn't have to be." For a moment, we just stood there, the silence between us thick and strange. I wanted to leave, but something about the way he looked at me made it impossible to move. Not because it was romantic, it wasn't. It was human. He looked at me the way no one else ever had, like I mattered. When the photographer called for the couple's portraits, he smiled faintly and said, "Take care of yourself. Lucy." My name sounded different coming from him, softer, more real. I watched him walk away, back toward the chaos, the cameras, the people who adored him for being Claire's perfect husband. And I stayed there for a long while, clutching my grandmother's dress and whispering to the night sky. "You were right, Grandma. Kindness is rarer than diamonds." When I finally rejoined the crowd, the laughter started again, but something inside me had shifted. Their words didn't sting the same way anymore. Maybe it was James's kindness, or maybe it was the realization that their cruelty said more about them than it ever did about me. As the music played and people danced under the shimmering lights, I stood quietly in the corner, my dress glowing faintly under the chandeliers like it had its own light. That night, as Claire tossed her bouquet and everyone cheered, I caught James's eyes one last time. He was smiling, but there was something behind it, a flicker of unease, like a man who'd seen a truth he couldn't unsee. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. Because sometimes the laughter that starts at the altar doesn't end there. Sometimes it follows you home, echoes in the walls, and becomes the sound that reminds everyone. What they mock today might be what haunts them tomorrow. The weeks after the wedding were strange. The laughter that had filled that glittering hall never really stopped echoing in my head. Every time I tried to sleep, I could still hear my sister's voice, sharp and mocking, cutting through the applause. "You actually wore that old thing?" The memory had a way of crawling back into my mind, poisoning even the quiet moments. But as much as it hurt, something inside me had shifted that day. Maybe it was the humiliation. Maybe it was the realization that I could stand in a room full of cruel faces and still keep my dignity intact. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the look in James's eyes, the one that said I wasn't invisible. Whatever it was, I began to change. Slowly, quietly. Claire and James returned from their honeymoon to a thunderstorm of attention. Their wedding photos had gone viral. Her perfect smile, her perfect dress, her perfect husband. Every news feed, every relative's post, every local magazine featured them as the couple of the year. My mother couldn't stop talking about it. "Your sister looks like a dream," she said one afternoon while scrolling through her phone. "She's glowing." Then, as if she couldn't help herself, she added, "You should really try dressing more like her, Lucy. You have nice features, but you don't do anything with them." I just nodded, sipping my tea, pretending her words didn't hurt the way they used to. 2 weeks later, Claire invited the family over for dinner at her new house, a sprawling 2-story villa that looked like something out of a magazine. I hesitated before saying yes, but I knew if I refused, my parents would guilt me about it for months. When I arrived, the place was buzzing with people, friends, co-workers, a few extended relatives. The house smelled like expensive perfume and roasted lamb. I was barely through the door before Claire wrapped me in a staged hug, her perfume suffocating. "Lucy, you made it! Everyone, this is my sister," she announced, her voice dripping with that same performative charm. People smiled politely, and I smiled back, trying to ignore the wave of déjà vu that hit me. I felt like a prop in her picture-perfect world. Dinner was beautiful, of course. The table was laid with golden cutlery and delicate china, and every dish looked like something from a 5-star restaurant. Claire sat at the head of the table, radiant and animated, telling stories about their honeymoon in Italy. James sat beside her, listening quietly, occasionally offering a small smile or a nod. But now and then, I caught his eyes drifting toward me, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but as if he was watching me carefully, studying me. I tried to focus on my food, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling of being seen. Halfway through dinner, one of Claire's friends, a tall woman with glossy hair and a wine glass glued to her hand, leaned over and asked, "So, Lucy, what do you do again?" I smiled politely. "I'm an illustrator. I paint and design book covers." She blinked, unimpressed. "Oh, that's cute." Claire giggled. "Yes, Lucy's always been the creative one." "She's a dreamer," she said, as if creativity were some charming flaw. The table laughed softly. My chest tightened, but I kept smiling. I'd learned long ago that silence was the best armor. After dinner, as people moved to the living room, I stepped outside for some air. The garden lights twinkled softly, and the night was cool and peaceful. I stood by the railing, breathing in the scent of roses, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "You really do have a gift, you know." I turned to see James. He was holding a glass of water, his tie loosened, his expression softer than I'd ever seen it. "Your paintings," he said when I didn't respond. "Claire showed me some of your work. The one with the bridge and the rain. It's beautiful." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. "Thank you," I said quietly. "That one's personal." He nodded. "It feels personal, like you painted a memory." We stood there in silence for a few seconds before he added, "You shouldn't let anyone make you feel small. Not even family." The sincerity in his tone caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond. No one in my life had ever said something like that to me, not without a trace of judgment or pity. Before I could say anything, Claire's voice floated from the doorway. "James!" she called, laughter in her tone. "What are you doing out here?" Her eyes flicked between us, and for a split second, something sharp and suspicious flashed across her face. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Lucy," she said sweetly. "I hope James isn't boring you with his work talk. He tends to ramble." I forced a laugh and stepped back. "Not at all," I said. "I was just leaving." That night I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation, or about the look on Claire's face. There was a tension there, subtle but undeniable. It was the first time I'd ever seen her unsure of herself. And it scared her. I didn't understand it at the time, but something had changed between them. A few days later, I received an email from James. It was short and professional. asking if I could recommend an artist for a mural project at one of his firm's new buildings. He said he admired my work and thought I might know someone who fit the style they wanted. I hesitated before replying, then finally sent back a polite note suggesting myself. His response came almost immediately. I was hoping you'd say that. Working with him was complicated. The project required several meetings at his office, which meant spending hours discussing sketches, colors, and concepts. He was always respectful, always professional, but there was a quiet energy between us, a recognition of sorts. We talked about art, philosophy, travel, and sometimes the quiet loneliness of growing up in families that only celebrated appearances. It was never inappropriate, never physical, but it was intimate in a way that scared me. I told myself it was just a connection, two people who understood each other in a world full of masks. But I also knew how it would look if anyone saw us together. One afternoon, while reviewing the final design, Claire appeared at the office unexpectedly. She walked in wearing sunglasses and a tight smile. "Well, isn't this cozy?" she said, her voice sugary sweet but laced with venom. "I just came to surprise my husband for lunch, and I find you two working so closely." James stood up immediately. "Claire, it's a professional project." "Oh, of course it is," she interrupted. "You've always been so helpful, haven't you, Lucy?" Her tone made the word sound dirty. I swallowed hard, keeping my composure. This was a commissioned piece, Claire. He needed an artist, and I was available. Her laugh was brittle. "You've always been available, haven't you?" The silence that followed was deafening. James's jaw tightened, and for the first time I saw anger flicker behind his calm demeanor. "That's enough," he said quietly. "You're being unfair." Claire blinked, stunned. No one ever talked to her like that, especially not him. She turned to me, eyes blazing. "You think you're so innocent, don't you? You've always wanted what's mine." Her words hit like a slap, but I stood my ground. "I don't want anything of yours, Claire," I said softly. "Not your husband, not your approval, not your life." She stared at me, trembling, and then stormed out, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. James looked at me helplessly, but I just shook my head. "Don't," I said. "This isn't your fault. The tension didn't end there." Word spread quickly. Claire told our parents that I was trying to ruin her marriage, that I'd been seducing James. My mother called, furious. "Lucy, how could you embarrass your sister like that?" She yelled. I tried to explain, but she didn't want to listen. To her, Claire's word was truth, and mine was noise. For the next few weeks, I stayed away from everyone. I buried myself in my art, painting until my fingers cramped. I poured everything, anger, sadness, guilt, into the canvas. My studio became my sanctuary, my only safe place. One night, while working late, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find James standing there, rain-soaked and exhausted. "I shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, "but I needed to tell you that none of this is your fault." I stepped aside silently, letting him in. He looked broken, like a man whose world was crumbling around him. "She's been different since the wedding," he confessed. "Paranoid, angry. It's like she's fighting ghosts that aren't there." I felt pity then, more than anything else. "James," I said gently, "you need to fix things with her." "Not me," he nodded, his eyes glassy. "I'm trying. But every time I do, she brings you up. It's like she can't let go." He left shortly after, and I stood at the door long after he disappeared into the night. My heart was heavy, not because of him, but because of the cruel irony of it all. The same sister who had spent her life mocking me now saw me as her greatest threat. And I hadn't even done anything. In the days that followed, I decided to distance myself completely. I finished the mural, sent the final invoice, and cut off all contact. But even then, I could feel the storm building. There was something fragile in the air, something ready to shatter. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The laughter from that wedding day had turned into whispers, and soon, those whispers would turn into something louder. What I didn't realize then was that the cracks in Claire's perfect life had already begun to spread. And I was standing right at the fault line, whether I liked it or not. The storm finally came. It didn't start with thunder or lightning, but with a whisper, a rumor that spread through town like smoke. People began to talk about Claire and James's marriage, about how the perfect couple was starting to crumble. I didn't know it at first. I only found out when a friend from the art gallery called to tell me she'd overheard someone saying that my sister had been seen leaving a restaurant in tears after a very public argument with her husband. My first instinct was to call Claire, but I stopped myself. Every time I tried to reach out, it ended with her voice raised and my heart bruised. So I stayed quiet, convincing myself that silence was safer. But silence doesn't stop a storm. It only gives it room to grow. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to a charity gala hosted by the architectural firm James worked for. It wasn't addressed to me directly. It came through my gallery as part of the artist roster they were sponsoring. My first instinct was to decline, but something inside me told me to go. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe defiance. Either way, that night I slipped into a simple navy blue gown and went. I remember walking into the grand ballroom, feeling the familiar sting of eyes turning toward me. It was just like Claire's wedding again, only this time I wasn't trembling. I wasn't the girl in the old dress being laughed at. I was Lucy, the artist whose mural had been praised in a city magazine just the week before. I didn't expect to see James there, but of course he was. He stood near the stage, surrounded by colleagues, smiling politely as people congratulated him on his firm's success. For a moment, I almost turned back. But before I could, he looked up and saw me. His expression shifted instantly from surprise to something softer. He excused himself and made his way over, the crowd parting effortlessly for him. "You came," he said, his voice quiet but filled with something unspoken. "Of course," I replied lightly. "It's an art event. My work's hanging on your wall, remember?" He smiled faintly, but there was exhaustion in his eyes. "I'm glad you're here. Things have been complicated." I nodded, though I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to ask about Claire, but I didn't have to, because she appeared just a moment later. She was radiant as always, wearing a crimson gown that turned heads. But behind that polished smile, I could see it, the tension in her jaw, the cold fury in her eyes. She walked straight toward us, her heels echoing like warning bells. "Lucy," she said sweetly, "how lovely to see you. I didn't realize you'd be here." Her tone was civil, but her glare could have sliced through glass. "The gallery invited me," I replied evenly. "It's part of my exhibition sponsorship." She nodded, pretending to be pleased, then turned to James. "Darling, why don't you go speak to Mr. Hawthorne? He's been asking for you." Her voice was sugary, but her grip on his arm was tight. He looked like he wanted to argue, but thought better of it. "I'll be back," he said quietly before walking away. The moment he was gone, her smile dropped. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" she hissed. "Claire, don't you dare say my name like that," she snapped. "You've been playing the victim your whole life, but I see what you're doing. You think just because people pity you, you can steal whatever you want. My attention, my friends, my husband." I stood there, stunned by the venom in her words. "I haven't stolen anything from you," I said softly. "You're the one who keeps seeing enemies where there aren't any." Her eyes blazed. "Then why does he keep looking at you? Why does he talk about your paintings? Do you know how humiliating that is? You, the sister who never had anything. Now suddenly everyone's talking about you." For a moment, I didn't know whether to feel angry or sorry for her. "Claire," I said finally, "you've built your whole life trying to be admired. But you've never been loved for who you are. That's not my fault." Her face went pale. She stared at me like she couldn't believe I'd dared to speak to her that way. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I tried to focus on the art, on polite conversations, on anything that would distract me. But when I finally left, I felt a strange heaviness in my chest, as if something irreversible had just happened. The next morning, I woke up to chaos. My phone was flooded with messages from relatives, friends, and even reporters. My sister's marriage had exploded publicly overnight. Someone had leaked a video from the gala, Claire yelling at James in the parking lot, accusing him of cheating with me. The clip had already gone viral, with gossip pages running wild. "Bride gone bitter," one headline read. "Sister rivalry turns scandalous," another said. My hands trembled as I scrolled through the comments. People were vicious. Some took Claire's side, calling me a homewrecker, and others mocked her breakdown, calling her jealous and unstable. It was everything I'd feared, and more. My parents called me in a panic, demanding to know what had happened. "What did you do, Lucy?" My mother shouted through the phone. "Your sister's reputation is in ruins." I tried to explain that I'd done nothing, that I hadn't even spoken to James privately that night, but she wouldn't listen. To her, I was always the problem. That week was the loneliest of my life. I stayed inside, ignored calls, and painted. The canvases filled with chaos, splashes of red, streaks of black, fragmented faces that screamed silently. My pain poured out in color and texture until I barely recognized my own hands. But in the middle of all that noise, I found something strange: clarity. I realized I couldn't keep living in the shadow of their cruelty. I had to step out, even if it meant being hated for it. A few days later, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, James was standing there again, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "She left," he said simply. "She packed her things and went to her parents. She's filing for divorce." I stared at him, unable to speak. "James, I'm so sorry," I whispered. He shook his head. "Don't be. This wasn't about you. It's been falling apart for a long time. You just happened to be the mirror that made us see it." His voice broke slightly on the last word. We sat in silence for a long while. He told me how Claire's insecurities had turned into paranoia, how she couldn't stand the idea that someone else, especially her sister, could be admired or respected. "She stopped seeing reality," he said. "Everything became about competition, about winning." When he finally left, I felt both relief and sorrow. Relief that I hadn't imagined the madness, sorrow that it had destroyed so much. I didn't see him again after that. A few months later, I heard through mutual contacts that he'd moved overseas, starting a new life, far away from the ruins of his marriage. As for Claire, she cut off all contact with me. My parents followed her lead, convinced I had played a part in her downfall. For a while, that isolation was unbearable. But then something unexpected happened. My art began to gain recognition. The same mural project that had started this whole mess was nominated for a city award. A local newspaper wrote a feature about me, calling my work an emotional symphony of resilience. For the first time, people saw me, not as someone's sister, not as the quiet girl in the background, but as an artist, a woman with her own story. When I opened my first solo exhibit months later, I wore my grandmother's dress again, the same one they'd mocked at the wedding. I had restored it, repaired every delicate thread until it shone softly under the gallery lights. People complimented it all night, asking if it was designer. I just smiled and said, "It's vintage. It's family." Toward the end of the evening, as the guests mingled and the cameras flashed, I noticed a familiar face near the door: Claire. She stood there hesitant, dressed in black, her eyes tired but sharp. The crowd seemed to melt away as she approached me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she said quietly, "You look happy." "I am," I said. It was the truth. She nodded, glancing around at the paintings on the walls. My work, my story, my healing. "You really made something out of all this," she murmured. I guess I was too busy trying to make everything perfect. There was no sarcasm this time, no bite, just regret. I looked at her and saw not the sister who had humiliated me, but the girl I used to share secrets with, the one who laughed under the stars before the world made her hard. "We all chase different things," I said softly. "You wanted admiration. I just wanted peace." She swallowed hard, then whispered, "I'm sorry, Lucy." Those 3 words took years to arrive, but when they did, I felt something inside me loosen. I smiled faintly and said, "I forgive you." She didn't stay long. She congratulated me quietly, took one last look at the mural on the central wall, a painting of two sisters standing apart under the same sky, and then left. I watched her go, not with anger, but with understanding. That night, as the gallery lights dimmed and the room emptied, I stood alone in my dress, surrounded by the art born from my pain. The laughter that once haunted me had finally faded into silence. I realized then that revenge doesn't always come in grand acts of retaliation. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is becoming everything they said you couldn't be.